All right, should be recording. Welcome. Um, my name is Granville Matheson, and I'm going to talk you through how to use my BIDS tool called Bloodstream. Bloodstream is aimed to allowing doing blood processing with BIDS data, BIDS PET data at least, where there is blood data available. And the idea is that it makes it a little bit easier for everyone to do blood processing so that you're ready for kinetic modeling using the processed blood data. You can download Bloodstream from GitHub, from my username followed by Bloodstream. You can use this code over here and it should install Bloodstream. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to start it running, and then I'm going to give a little bit of a talk about blood processing and how we can think about it, and then we can actually go into looking through the data itself. So in R, we basically start off by loading tidyverse for data manipulation, Bloodstream, and then I'm going to do a little bit of kinetic modeling later, so I'll load kinfetter 2. Here is the study path. So we basically say this is where our data lives. So we say, there we go. If we look at the folder itself, we can see it over here. So this is where our markdown document is. And we go back and I've placed the data over here. I've downloaded it with DataLad, and we should have all the blood data there. Yeah, so that's our study path. We run that. And then to run it, we basically just do Bloodstream study path equals study path, and we can go start. So this is how we run it to basically do a very, very basic blood processing where it simply runs linear interpolation on every single step. We're going to progress to using a slightly more advanced method of blood processing later, but I will discuss blood processing first while this runs, and then we can move into that. So I have some slides. Let's go. Okay, so Bloodstream for blood processing with BIDS. So the fundamental problem with blood processing or blood data for PET is that what we want differs from what we get. So what we want high frequency data. We want to know what the radioactivity concentration in the blood was at each point in time with very high temporal granularity. We also want specificity. So we want measurements of exactly what we want. And lastly, we want accuracy. We want little to no measurement error. We want to reduce the measurement error as much as we possibly can. However, in reality, we can measure with high frequency, but not what we really want. We can measure what we really want, but with low frequency because we have to record data from multiple sources. And because of these multiple sources, we have errors in each of those sources. So what we end up with is data which basically we have to do some processing to actually get our data to look the way that we want it to. So if we imagine we just want to know the radioactivity in the blood, we can just take a blood sample and we look at the radioactivity. So we take a little blood sample and we put it into a gamma counter and we can measure its radioactivity. It's easy as that. If we want to measure a little bit more quickly, some groups make use of, this is called manual sampling. Some groups use an auto sampler where it's basically a tube that sucks the blood through and measures radioactivity inside the blood at each time point. However, the first big issue is that not all of the radioactivity in the blood is actually available to enter the brain. Some of it is bound to blood cells, but the rest of it is in the plasma. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to separate how much of the blood is bound, how much the radioactivity is bound to blood cells, and how much of it is in the plasma. So we take our manual samples, and instead of putting it directly into the gamma counter, we put it first into a centrifuge. And we centrifuge out all the blood cells, and then we put the plasma into the gamma counter. Hooray, now we have plasma radioactivity. But the next issue is that, well, not all of that radioactivity is actually attributable to the parent compound itself, the compound that binds to our target. So let's say this is our compound, and over here is our radioactive radionuclide. As it travels through the blood, as it passes through the kidneys or the livers, they might metabolize it. They might chop it up into smaller pieces. So for example, if there's a chop over there, then we're left with this compound. Or if there's a chop over here, then we're left with this compound. And both of these compounds are radioactive because they still have the radionuclide attached to them, but they aren't the original compound, and they don't, or hopefully shouldn't, but bind the target, and they don't, or hopefully shouldn't, cross the blood-brain barrier. So we need to figure out how much of our radioactivity is actually the parent compound. So we go back to our manual sampling, we take our samples, we put them in the centrifuge, we then put them into a radio HPLC. So this is high performance liquid chromatography. It separates out each of the compounds that we have, and we can measure the radioactivity within each of them. So let's say this over here on the right is our target compound, and these are three, or our parent compound, and these three are daughter compounds that are the metabolites metabolized by the body. So when it comes to the BIDS data itself, we have various columns that we need to combine to form our final curve. So firstly, we have the autosampler, whole blood radioactivity, the manual whole blood radioactivity, the manual plasma radioactivity, and the manual metabolite parent fraction. So the first step, well, actually, the first thing to say is, if you're an analyst and you get this data from your chemists, as I have been, and I was handed this data, and I would sort of complain, oh, it looks a little bit noisy. Just know that there's been a lot of work has gone into this, and there's been a lot of running around, putting things into tubes, taking things out, putting things in here. So we expect things to be, we can't expect things to be perfect, because it is lots of different steps and lots of different analyses. So when we get the data like this, it's already a miracle that it's on our desk. Be happy, and let's try to do as best as we can with it. So the first step, we have our whole blood radioactivity. So we would combine these two columns. So that's the data that comes out of the autosampler, and then the data from the manual samples. And if we put those together, we get the whole blood radioactivity curve, and it looks a bit like that. The next thing we want is like, well, now we want to separate how much is in the plasma. So we have these manual samples of the plasma, but what we typically do is combine that with the manual samples at the same time points of the whole blood radioactivity to get a blood to plasma ratio curve, or a plasma to blood ratio curve if you invert it. So that basically looks like this. And what we often do is fit a line to that to say, well, we assume that much of this noise is actually due to measurement error, as opposed to actually the true blood plasma ratio fluctuating like this. So we'll fit a smooth curve to this and say, well, so now we know what we anticipate the blood to plasma ratio would have been at this data point, at this time that we didn't measure for. And it also allows us to hopefully reduce some of the error in these measurements. So we've now got our blood plasma ratio. We can use that to remove the proportion of the data or the proportion of the radioactivity that we assume is bound to blood cells. So we combine the whole blood radioactivity from the autosampler and from the manual samples and the plasma radioactivity through the blood to plasma ratio, and we get a curve that looks like this, the whole plasma radioactivity. So we basically divide the whole blood radioactivity by the blood to plasma ratio to get this curve. So the next thing we want to do is to say, well, how much of this is attributable to the parent compound? So we look at this, the metabolite parent fraction, which is this curve over here. We want to know what the parent fraction would have been at each time point, so we typically fit a line to that. And this also allows us to hopefully reduce some of the error. So we say, well, we assume that this measurement was a little bit higher than the true value, but we can also introduce some bias in this process too, as with all modeling. So what we're saying in this curve is that, well, at time 0, 100% of the radioactivity was attributable to the parent compound because it was injected, it hadn't had time to be metabolized. But at this time point over here, for instance, at say it's about 32 minutes or something, the parent fraction was about 10%. So 90% of the radioactivity is attributable to metabolites, and 10% of it is attributable to the parent compound itself. So we want to multiply this by the plasma radioactivity. So we now, in order to get the final plasma parent radioactivity, we use all of these four curves. We take the whole blood radioactivity, we divide it by the blood to plasma ratio, and we multiply it by the parent fraction to get the plasma parent radioactivity, which is what we typically use as our arterial input function. And sometimes we'll also fit a line to that too. There are several models for this. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's preferable, sometimes it's not. All of these modeling decisions are up to you. The important thing that I wanted to get across, though, is that you typically do not have direct measurements of the arterial input function. Of course, it's possible that every single sample you put through your you spin, and then you also put it in the HPLC, but it's extremely time consuming, and you're not going to have that many data points at the end of the day. So what we typically do is we try to use all of these in order to try to get the best that we can, to get the temporal granularity from the autosampler and manual samples, to get the specificity from the plasma and the metabolite parent fraction measurements. But the actual AIF curve at the end is almost always a calculated quantity, and whether you fit models to these curves, or whether you simply interpolate them with linear interpolation, that's up to you as the modeler, but the final quantity that you use is a modeled or estimated quantity. So let's get back to the demo. So at this point, we should have, right, so our modeling is finished. So if we go back to our data set over here, in the derivatives folder, we should now have, I've already done another processing for later to discuss, but we have here our data, and in each folder we have a highly interpolated input function. So this is the time, the whole radioactivity, the plasma radioactivity, metabolite parent fraction, and the arterial input function. And we have some details about exactly what we did. We also have a report over here, which we can open. So here is our analysis. We've got a table of contents. We can see all the code if we want, so that if you want to try to do things manually, you can basically take the code and modify from there. So this is the modeling decisions that we made. So the parent fraction, we simply used interpolation. The blood plasma ratio, we used interpolation. The arterial input function, we used interpolation. And the whole blood, we used interpolation. That's what happens when we don't provide a config file. If you remember, when we did this, we simply gave it a study path and no configuration file. That means that the only thing it does is interpolates everything. It doesn't make any specific modeling decisions. It does mean, however, that it's used linear interpolation, which you can think of it as not a modeling decision. I think it's better to actually think of it as a modeling decision. That is your decision. You've interpolated everything, and you could have fit a model, but you did not. So the first thing to do, we can look at what the data looks like. We have in purple the parent fraction. This is with normal time. This is with log scaled axes. So we can see the parent fraction goes down and then up a little bit. We can see in green, we can see the whole blood. We can see in red the arterial input function, and we can see in blue, although it's cut off because some tracers are down here, the blood plasma. This particular tracer has a higher blood compared to plasma, or higher blood compared to the plasma, exactly. So it's up here. And basically, these are the curves that we've produced. As you can see, there are some things that don't look exactly as we would anticipate biologically. For instance, over here, we have a little flat part over there. Over here, it's yeah. Basically, you can see there's some room for improvement in these data points, which is why we typically model these. Because as I mentioned earlier, this data comes from multiple different sources from multiple different measurements, there is a lot of possibility for errors in the actual measurement of all of these things. So because we've not done any modeling, then the final curves look exactly the same as they did before. All right, and then we have the session info. So for this is where Bloodstream comes along and says, well, usually we do a little bit of modeling. So what we do is what I made is a configuration. I made a little web app, so you can actually design your configuration file, because I have had bad experiences with configuration files in the past. So this is a nice way of designing a configuration file with sort of pull down menus, and you can decide all of your modeling options, and then you just download it at the end and you run Bloodstream again. So over here on the left is if you want to subset your data. So you want to restrict it to only, what are the names of the data points? Let me see. Here, so let's say sub PS19 and sub PS20. So you might say PS19 and PS20. You only want to run those two subjects. This allows you to basically run Bloodstream on only subsets of the data. So subjects, session, recording, task, run, tracer name. So this is if you have multiple traces in your data set, you'll probably want to run different settings for each of these. The mode of administration, if it's bolus or bolus infusion, the institution, if you have multiple groups, you can actually also run it specifically on one specific group's data. As pharmaceutical name, this is if you have blocking and non-blocking data. So the parent fraction, you can choose your model. So in our case, one might choose, I would say usually this is a pretty good option, choosing the best fitting model. However, for this tracer happens to be one of the fairly special ones that doesn't really correspond to any of the models. As you can see, most tracers start at 1 and then decrease over the course of the measurement. This one decreases and then increases again. And the paper itself talks about the fact that this is because it actually binds to blood cells. The parent compound binds to blood cells. And over the course of the measurements, it is actually released from blood cells. And so we have a reintroduction of parent compounds into the blood, into the plasma. So we have parent fraction goes down, but then increases again towards the end. And so none of the ordinary models can actually fit that. So what we can actually do, we can fit it using a generalized additive model, which is effectively a spline. However, my personal preference for these kind of things is to use hierarchical splines. These are a little bit more complicated, so I apologize for showing this. I kind of advise, I've said over here, I think hierarchical models are best left for experienced users, which is true. I'm an experienced user. I wrote it. So in this case, what we can do, we can say we want to fit hierarchical GAM, but we are going to we have to specify the HGAM smooth formula. In this case, we have multiple measurements per individual and multiple individuals as well. So this is to say we want to smooth across time. So this is going to be the average smooth. We're going to have then a smooth function for deviations from the average smooth, which is fine. And I would probably, because we have multiple measurements for each individual, I'm going to also introduce a smooth function for deviations from the average for each individual. So we'll have sub here. So that means that we have an average smooth function. We have deviations for each subject, which accounts for both of their measurements. And then we have smooth deviations for each PET measurement. So that's for the deviations within measurements from the expected curve for the individual. When it comes to blood to plasma ratio, some models have constant blood to plasma, some radioligands have constant blood to plasma ratio, some have linear functions. Most, in my experience, have non-linear models. So here we can fit a GAM. Again, my favorite is hierarchical GAMs, where we can actually use the knowledge that we get between individuals. So in this case, I might fit a very similar function for that. So we're saying an average blood to plasma ratio, we have deviations for each individual, and then we have deviations for each PET measurement from the individual function. Lastly, the arterial input function. We don't have to fit this. I quite like, I mean, let's fit it here if we feel like it. So we can do a linear rise and tri-exponential decay. That's a pretty common model. Although the linear rise portion is, we have the Feng model that doesn't typically work very well except for FDG. We have the Feng conv, which is a Feng model convolved with an injection period, an infusion time, or we have just a spline model that smooths it out. These are really good for if you have very noisy autosampler data. But in this case, I'll just use FengConv. I'll talk you through a couple of the options that we have as well. So the time subsetting, this allows us to say, well, let's fit the data only from, say, 5 minutes until the end. We don't really want to do that here. In each of these, we have time subsetting as well. So in each different option, if we were to be fitting individual GAMs, then we can choose the dimensionality of the basis. So that basically defines how the maximum bound on the wiggliness of the function. So because we're using a hierarchical GAM, we're not using that, but we do have to define these for each of our functions here. For our arterial input function, we have this. These are basically the what proportions of the decay should be used for choosing start parameters. So that's basically when the function is decreasing, it needs to define starting parameters for this. I think this is best left blank unless you kind of understand what you're doing. But if the fits aren't great, you can start messing around with these. And I would advise you read the Kinfitter documentation about those. Lastly, the injection infusion duration. In this case, we can set it either if we know that each injection was for 30 seconds, then we can say 30. Or if the range is unknown, we can say, well, between 25 and 35. In this case, from the paper presenting this data, it says that all injections were of about 60 seconds. So let's bound this between, say, 45 and 75 seconds. This is if you're doing splines, you can set these, but you don't usually need to. Lastly, you can, after all of these steps, model the whole blood as well. This isn't usually necessary. However, if you have, so the whole blood data is used for the blood volume fraction, which is basically subtracted from your TAC to say, well, this proportion, say 5% of the volume of the TAC is comprised of blood, and we know we've measured the blood radioactivity concentration, so we can actually remove that. If we have very noisy autosampler data, it can be a little bit of a pain. So I've added the option to do spline fitting to that, but usually that's not necessary. Often that's not necessary. You can also perform dispersion correction on your autosampler samples over here if you choose. If you have the dispersion, basically you need a few parameters for actually doing this, and they need to be in your BIDS data sets. In this case, they aren't provided, so we just leave that. So lastly, we go to the download column, and we have created our customized config file. So if we click download, we download it. As it happens, I have already created one of these. It should be in the code section over there. So I did this a while back and at about the time for BrainHack. So if we look in here, basically, this is all the things that we did. And we fit hierarchical blood to plasma ratio, and we fit hierarchical parent fraction, hierarchical GAMs rather. And we fit FengConv, the FengConv model to the arterial input function. So if we go back to our data sets, we go into derivatives. Here we have the original bloodstream derivative. So this is the processing where we didn't provide any configuration file. When you do provide a configuration file, it provides, as you saw when we downloaded it here, you have the date and you have a set of random letters. That basically just defines the function. defines which configuration file it is. So when we run with that file, I can actually show you in here. So if we want to run with the configuration file, then instead of running just bloodstream study path, we run bloodstream study path equals study path, config path equals, and there's the configuration path. So we simply provide where the config file is, and then it'll run with all of those settings. So if we go back here, here is the one that we ran with the configuration file. Now we have everything just like we did last time. We have a little configuration file over here saying these were the things that we used. These were the parameters, the arterial input function and the fitted model. We have a little JSON file saying these are what all the quantities are, and we have a highly interpolated set of all the functions. And as we did before as well, we have a little report. So we can look through our report over here. So once again, it tells us what we did at the beginning so that we can look. We've got some quality control checks over here. So parent fraction, no issues. Blood plasma, no issues, no issues. Basically, this will tell us, listen, you have some really weird blood plasma ratio values. So this might say, for instance, there's a very, very, very early time point when both of these values is effectively 0, and we might get an infinite value. We could then choose to, when modeling the blood plasma ratio, to have a little bit of a time subsetting. So we say, well, you know what, let's ignore the first value, which is at, say, 1 minute. So let's only look from 2 minutes on. In the parent fraction, this will tell us if we have values of over 100%, for instance. So first we look at the raw data. This is what the raw data looks like, which we've seen before in the first analysis. Now we move on to the modeling. So firstly, the parent fraction, we get some diagnostic plots. We can look at the QQ plot of the residuals, which looks pretty okay. We can look at the residuals versus linear predictor to look for heteroscedasticity, the histogram of the residuals, and the observer's fitted values. We can also look at our smooth functions. So this is the average smooth function across all individuals. All right, so this is what our model says. Well, this is what the average individual would have. These are the deviations for subject. So this subject tended to have, from this curve, they would be slightly increasing throughout the course of the measurement. And then these are the deviations for each PET measurement. So there are 20 curves here, 10 curves here, and 1 curve over here, because we have 10 individuals and 10 individuals. We have 1 average, 10 individuals, and 20 PET measurements. As we can also see, these occupy more variance than these values do. So this suggests that actually we're picking up most of the variance that we see between PET measurements with this subject deviations, which is great. This suggests that subjects are more that individuals in the data set are more similar to each other than they are to. I mean, the noise is not just PET measurement based. It's more that individuals are similar to the other measurement of that same individual. Then we can move to looking at the fits of the parent fraction. So, for instance, this data point over here has suggested to our model that, you know what, we don't have that data point across all of these individuals, but because we do for this one, probably there's a very, very little hump over here. Whether or not that's true or not, we don't know. Or whether it's simply measurement error. But basically, this is to say that our model is learning across all of the individuals about what the general shape of the model is, which is usually a good thing. If we have really bad data points here or there, it can be a bad thing, in which case we might want to consider using a different likelihood function, for instance, like a robust model where we use a T distribution. However, you're going to have to do that on your own. Basically, the bloodstream package is designed to do a lot of things that you might usually do, but if you want to do really advanced things, you're going to have to go and do that yourself, which is why you can actually get the code that was used here and you can modify it to do the thing that you actually want to do. So here we can look at all of our fits. So here's subject 20, for instance, goes down and then up a lot and up a lot over here. Subject 24 has less of a rise again. This is basically talking about the fact that subjects resemble each other, and this is our fitted curve. So all of these, I would say, look pretty okay. I wouldn't be worried about any of these. So then we insert the predictions in. We then have our blood to plasma ratio. Here we have our QQ plot of the residuals, our residuals versus linear predictors. This suggests to me, as we can see, there's more variance at higher values and less variance at lower values. This suggests to me that probably the likelihood function is not exactly correct. Whether or not it has a big difference, that's to be observed. But and my general experience is that even modeling the blood to plasma ratio doesn't tend to have that big of an impact on things, but it is something to keep in mind. When we look at these diagnostic plots, we can say, maybe this is something to be thinking about. When we look at our average function, it looks like that. Our smooth function, our functions across each subject look like that. And as you can see, there's a lot more variance here than across PET, which is, once again, it's really good. It suggests that subjects resemble each other and that the variance is not just from PET measurement to PET measurement, which would be more likely explained by measurement error. And we can look then at our functions. So basically over here, our model has said, well, it's because I have this function on PET2, probably these values are a little bit too high and we don't need to go all the way up there. So it's learning across the data sets what it anticipates. And similarly, this value over here, based on PET1, it's saying, well, you know what? This is unlikely to be a true value. I'm going to only go this far down. And we can look at our fits, and they all look, I don't know, pretty okay. As I say, with blood to plasma ratio, my experience has never been that it makes a really enormous difference on things, but it certainly could. I mean, blood modeling is very, you really need to be thinking about what you're modeling and what, there's a lot of modeling decisions to go to be, I don't know, to be made effectively. So now we look at our models fit to the arterial input function. If you recall from earlier, I think the most important point that I want to get across is that the arterial input function is not a directly measured quantity. It is the product of all of the previous steps. So it's the product of our parent fraction model. It is the product of our blood to plasma ratio model. So it's really important to consider that errors in these steps can produce data points that don't make sense over here. And if we fit the data to those data points that don't make sense, then we're getting like garbage in, garbage out. In this case, I think that these look pretty okay. And we've now fit our models to each of these curves. We can look at the rise best using the log scaled axis. So as we can see, there's a little bit of an offset here, which suggests that the autosampler values are probably not properly scaled because they're all above 0, where they ought to be hanging around 0. But our model has adequately dealt with that by having a time 0 where it's saying, well, it's going to be 0 up until a certain point where the rise occurs. So our model is improving our data in that regard. And then it goes up and it comes down. And we can look at all of our fits, and they look pretty good, I would say. So you can use both the original and the log scaled axis. This is the one that determines more how much of an impact it'll make in the modeling. This is to basically get an idea of how well it's fitting all the data points. In this case, you can see it's ignoring the autosampler going down here because that would involve having to come back up for the manual points. It's saying, well, probably that's incorrect. Whether or not that's true or not, we don't know. But here it's saying basically this could well, I don't know. The model assumes that this is incorrect and it's going up there. How much of an impact it makes, we can look over here. I mean, when it comes to VT, we're effectively comparing the area under the curve of this curve. This amount of area under the curve is probably going to make very little difference. So yeah, we can see our model fits. Here it's had a bit more of a difficult time with the rise, but it's probably okay. Here it suggests that maybe the scaling of this point is not quite up to scratch. Who knows what the true values are. When it comes to the actual modeling itself, I mean, so as we see, when we look at how much of extra area would be explained by this, probably not very much. So if you're looking at VT, it's probably not going to have that big of an impact. So we're fitting our infusion time values. As I mentioned, the infusion, that's TI, that's the parameter. As we mentioned in the paper, it said that the infusion time was about 60 seconds for each of the measurements. As we can see, we have 56, 59, 58, 57, 59, 56. So our model seems to be doing a really good job, actually, in most cases, of estimating the length of time for which the infusion took place. A couple of these look a little bit awry, 152. But if our curve still, if our curve is good enough, it's probably not going to make that much of an impact. So then we have our final plots where we can look at everything together. I think it's important to look through these because it's good to basically just see how everything is made. So we can see that this curve looks okay, but if this curve doesn't quite look okay, we can sort of start looking at these two. We can't see the blood plasma ratio in this case, but we can start to figure out where things might have gone awry if they have gone awry. So we can see basically the fitted values to each of our curves. So at the end of the day, we get these values out and we can use those for some kinetic modeling. So I've gone ahead and done a little bit with them just to be able to show you. So let's fit some tags just to demonstrate what we can do with the outputs of bloodstream. So the bloodstream inputs then, in KinFitter, that's my kinetic modeling package. I've added a new function saying bloodstream input functions. We can say this is where the derivatives folder is located, and we boom, and we've now loaded up the input functions. So if we look at this variable, this is session, subject, task, acquisition, run, recording, measurement, and here is our interpolated input function. So in this particular data set, over here, in the derivatives folder, that's using this bloodstream folder over here, where we've actually done modeling of the curves. Other derivatives folders that were provided here, one of them is the PET surfer output, which contains, I hope I can find it. One of the files in here is a tax.tsv file. So this contains all of the tax. So that's great. We can run another pipeline and generate the tax, and we can use those for our modeling. So here, you don't need to worry too much about this. I'm basically parsing the derivatives files and then loading in the tax. I do a little bit of a hacky thing with the hippocampus. I sort of take the average value between the left and right hippocampus in order to generate a combined hippocampus ROI, or TAC at least, and we combine it with the bloodstream inputs, and we can plot them. So here are this is the input function, and this is the TAC for this combined hippocampus. And they look pretty much as they should. And yeah, so we can actually get to trying to model these and see if we can get some VC values out of there. So what I've done, just for the sake of the demonstration, I fit the MA1 model, which is a linear model. It's very quick. You need to include a T-star value, which is the number of minutes after equilibrium is reached. So we fit the model, we extract the parameters, and then we can look at our fits. So in this case, the MA1 model is only fitting the data after a certain point. But basically our values look like that, or our fits look like that. We can then plot before to after. So here is the pre and here is the post VT value generated using MA1 for each subject. So basically that's what I wanted to say. If you really want to do incredibly specific things with your blood modeling, bloodstream is probably not for you. Bloodstream is designed for those of you who want to have most of the functionality with the least of the effort. I've made it highly basically it's streamlined. It can run everything from start to finish, generate your outputs, and you can do your modeling with that. It does most of the things that I would run in a normal analysis. If I was really trying to do things as particularly as I possibly could, I might alter the input function, or I might for some traces, they even try to design new models for actually fitting the input, fitting the parent fraction. In this case, I think a spline is probably a really good option. But yeah, so bloodstream should hopefully provide a good enough, and in fact, 95% of what you would see in the literature could probably be done with bloodstream. It's only the very specific things where people fit novel models, or if they do things slightly differently. And you can generate your input functions, and then you can do your kinetic modeling, whether you feel like doing that in Kinfitter, which I don't know. I like, because I made it, I wrote it. But if you want to do your modeling in PMod or whatever, you can basically do that. But this is a way of doing your blood processing in a streamlined fashion, where you don't need to worry too much about, or I don't know, where you have quite some room to customize everything through the configuration file generator. So you can really design the analysis that you want to do, and you get your outputs at the end of the day. All right. Thanks very much for your patience. And do shoot me a mail or get in touch with me somehow if you have any questions, or if you're struggling to use it, because I'd be very happy to help. Yeah. All right. Cheers.